some up to the timekeeping. I encourage all teams to offer and take viewpoints to part of the game. Without further ado, we welcome the Prime Minister to open the debate here.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things from opening government. Firstly, why this massively helps minorities who are disproportionately likely to face these mental harms in the first place. Secondly, why the extent of health of is greater and awareness is greater on our side. And thirdly, why on their side you get attachment to individual blame, which is bad for all these people. 3 things on setup. Firstly, the focus on this specifically looks like societal narratives focusing on this, but also things like media and TVs and movies focusing on this as well. For example, this looks like a black individual going to an Ivy League school suffering massively from mental health issues because of people bullying, discrimination at the university, etc. Right? But secondly, I would say on some comparative, there's typically like some level of focus on individuals as well. For example, this looks like people like psychiatrists that are going to prescribe individual medication to these individuals, for example, or you're going to get people asking how you're doing on your day, for example. This is obviously likely to happen, one, because these people still have the incentive to make these people better to begin with, so medical knowledge as a profession is still likely to exist. But secondly, I would say many people on a daily basis converse with individuals about their individual preferences, how they feel on a daily basis, and that is still likely to exist on either side of the house. It's far more about what society as a whole perceives this to be in general. Thirdly, on the background, there's a bunch of things that can come in. Firstly, there's like the socioeconomic factor that could be a way in which people have mental health issues to begin with, but also how there's a lack of things like help around them that could help them receive these kind of things like therapy, etc. This looks like discrimination and bullying on the daily level that leads these people having these issues. For example, this also looks like how you treat them in the workplace, how individual interactions that you might have with other people, or the societal factors that influence how these people can deal with their mental illness, how these people have mental illnesses to begin with. Firstly, let's talk about why minority and people that are most vulnerable in society massively disproportionately suffer from mental health issues to begin with. I would say this is just true in and of itself. Firstly, because many of the factors that happen around them, for example, discrimination that they face, the fact that they do not have enough food to put on the table on a daily basis, that keeps them anxious and worried at night, for example, the fact that they do not have freedom in their life to be able to explore their preferences, all this massively leads these people having these mental health issues to begin with. But secondly, many times they do not have the money to be able to afford things like therapy, for example, or get the needed support that actually lead to alleviating these issues in general in the first place. That is why people like minority, people that are black, people that are minorities within many countries face these problems on a disproportionate level. What we uniquely do is we provide attention to that thing. For example, we have videos and media that focuses on these issues to begin with. That's why people understand that many times there's a correlation between things like economic factors and the fact that these people are suffering in the first place. That is what you don't get on their side when you focus on individual levels. You don't focus on the fact that there is a disproportionate correlation. You don't focus on the fact that there are factors that inherently influences these people to be suffering on a daily level. That's what you don't get on their side. When you get this on our side, firstly, you obviously get things like more tangible awareness of the issue. The fact that these things do cause these issues in and of itself is something that people understand to begin with. And that is why when you see a person, a black person who is suffering from depression, you understand that this person is suffering because of the discrimination that occurs, etc. But secondly, in tandem with that, obviously that leads to things like political capital concentrating to help these people with these issues. That's why you get things like therapy in specific regions, for example, where black kids are suffering on the street, for example. You get things like centers for these people, etc. That is why these people can uniquely get this help on our side. Later. Secondly, let's talk about why the extent of help we get is greater, which is obviously going to mechanize this first point as well. I just first want to know, I think we get far more coverage on the issue of mental health to begin with. There's a bunch of reasons why this is true. The first reason is because it ties into the media incentives that many of these media companies have to begin with. Firstly, because many times being external, an issue being external is far more easier to depict than an issue being internal. For example, it's very difficult and nuanced to interpret and understand someone that is suffering mentally individually. However, it's very easy to depict things like discrimination, for example. That is something that many of these media companies would want to depict in the first place. But secondly, it's many times more society relevant to many people in general. The fact that it's a societal issue makes it relevant to a majority of people, and therefore media has an incentive to cover this to begin with, right? But secondly, it intertwines with other things like social movements, other narratives that already exist. This looks like, for example, social movements like Black Lives Matter talking about mental health, for example. It's like feminism talking about mental health, for example. That is why you get widespread coverage uniquely on our side. But thirdly, I would say individuals feel far more comfortable talking about this issue in general. When it's individualized, it's personal, it's private to you. That is when you don't want to speak out about your own issues because it feels like something that is private to you. However, when we provide the fact that it's a societal factor that we can all fight against, that is when these individuals feel far more comfortable talking about this issue. That is why you get far more coverage in this way. That is why more awareness, the fact that people are just simply aware of the fact that mental health issues exist and is a serious thing in our society is uniquely achieved on our set house, right? But secondly, I would say that people feel far more able to help other people. There's a bunch of reasons for this. Firstly, it's many times difficult for you to go out and help someone that is suffering from a mental health issue when you see it as individualized, when you see it as something that is individual to them. You shouldn't interfere in that. It's their private matter. You can't possibly help them because obviously it's not your fault. It's their own thing that they're going through. That is why many times it's just taboo for you to talk about things like mental health. You engage in that actively because you see it as something that is external to you. However, on our side, you feel far more empathetic, or you feel far more complied to help these person, especially just simply for the reason that you obviously know that is external to them. You can obviously help them with the external factors like their work relationships that they're suffering from. These are tangible things that many people can interact with to help this person to begin with, right? But secondly, you're far more likely to be massively empathetic to this individual, just simply because if it's an external issue, then you can actively see them suffering. I think it's easier for people to conceptualize that. When you do not have mental health, it's very difficult to understand the individualized personal failures that they're going through, or like the lack of dopamine that these people feel. It's something that's very difficult to conceptualize for people that don't face it, whereas things like discrimination is obviously easier for these people to conceptualize. Okay.
Someone who doesn't struggle with poverty or isn't from a minority community is far less likely to watch a TV show when a TV show's description of mental illness has no relatability to them whatsoever. Doesn't engagement therefore substantially reduce on your on it?
Number one, people are still likely to watch this. I just think this is an assertion that isn't true. Many people watch movies about minority people, for example. Many people watch movies about LGBTQ, even if they are LGBTQ. That just isn't, in and of itself, isn't true. But secondly, we obviously get other depictions as well. The fact that we have a focus on this basically diversifies this kind of depiction because of things like competition mechanisms between media companies, that we get more depiction on our side, and that makes it better. Lastly, why you get the individual blame. Many people in society believe that depression is an individual blame thing, right? People blame themselves for this because of the narrative that there's been just laziness that contributed to have depression, etc., that's always existed throughout history. What you do is exacerbate this narrative. For example, for many of the individuals that suffer from this, it's very difficult for them to externalize the mental illness that they have, basically because they live on it on a daily basis. They do not have any escape from it, but many times they internalize it over time when they feel as if other people tell you that you just go to work, you just get over it, etc. These people aren't rational in these instances. And when people keep asking you, what happened to you, what is wrong with you, when they ask you individual questions, that is when people feel as if they are to blame in these instances. In the comparative, when you blame external factors, what happened at your job, for example, what is wrong with discrimination around you, that is when these people can feel this weight lifted off of their shoulders to the external factor that is this. This is obviously good for individuals feeling as if they don't have to blame themselves. They're far more likely to reach out to things like therapy, change their toxic circumstances that led to them having this in the first place, and therefore all levels speak with this debate.
We'd like to thank the speaker for an excellent speech and welcome the leader of the opposition here.
Three, two, one. The struggle with addressing mental health is twofold. One, in the most extreme cases, the solution is not clear. The medication that you get is not going to resolve the depression that you feel on a day-to-day basis. It might just lower it a little. Then you have to do the work of figuring out how to address and live with the remaining depression, mental health issues that arise. The only point of access for improvement is on the individual relational level. That is, whether you are extended the empathy that you deserve in that situation and in that moment of intense struggle. Two, it is highly, highly personal in both its experience and its treatment. That is to say, being raised in a single-parent household is not the end-all be-all of your social struggle. Because one person could be raised by a corporate mother who gets $200,000 a year, is able to financially support you, versus you, like another person who's also a single-parent household, raised by a blue-collar worker who has struggled to maintain her economic stability. What does it look like then to focus on the individual level? It recognizes the buildup from small micro moments in your life that caused you or contributed to the pain that you feel now. That means that it's how your parents treated you, plus whether or not you got that job you really wanted, plus whether or not you felt really loved by the family members that you were involved with, plus the infinite amount of experiences that you will have on a day-to-day basis that make that day feel worth living for the next. This is incredibly important because it means that the societal factors that they want to reduce you to can never fully encompass what your life truly meant for yourself. The framing and burden then is, how do we best address and get treatment and support for people with mental health issues? This is important because it is incredibly difficult in either world to fully address and apparently solve mental health. Some people will simply always be depressed. I'll get into why this matters in a moment. 3 claims then. First, blame is likely to substantially reduce and decrease on our side. Why? 3 reasons. First, when others people succeed where you didn't, there is a constant self-blame on their side of the house. Because I've reduced myself to, I am a woman who is also queer, who is also from a single-parent household. That means that if I see someone who also fits those 3 or 4, or I don't know, even if they want to say 7 categorizations, that has been more successful than me, who has become Olympic athlete where I couldn't, even though that was my dream, I blame myself because they share the same exact experience as me, or a similar enough one that I should have been able to persevere where they did. The important difference is that on our world, yes, you probably still blame a little, but at the very least, you recognize that it's an individual ability for you to change, for you to shift your perspective, to recognize that there are factors that are so infinite that you were unable to control, that you just have to persevere in the ways that you can too. What happens if you do succeed or combat the societal factors they present? Your blame doubles, because if I'm still depressed, as a privileged individual who is has every actual tangible need met, material need met, but I'm being told that that means that my struggle is not as intense as an individual who is experiencing depression with also these other societal factors of lack of privilege, I am likely to blame myself more for not being able to be in a better state of mental health. The issue is that the framing must be that there are societal factors that can be solved that should reduce your mental health or your struggles with it. That means that their blame is likely is intensely higher on their side later. 3, interpersonal friends and family relationships don't have to cross the divide on our side of self-reflection to such an extent to properly support you. That is to say, on their side, they have to be they have to force their parents to reckon with the fact that the pass down of intergenerational trauma was the reason that they were shitty to their children. On our side, we are pushing that as an individual responsibility or point of blame. That is to say that the parent just has to go, you've had a really tough life, and it's not just because of me, it's because of all of these other factors, and I want to properly support you. The difference is the parents have to be ready on their side to recognize the harm that they caused. Question from closing.
This debate is about a focus in society, and note I am not downplaying the extent to which privileged people feel pain, suffering, and mental illness at all. But don't you think the relative privilege that they have means they will generally be better able to access some degree of coping mechanism on either side, whereas on our side they can't?
Okay, your OG did talk about POC and Ivy Leagues. That's still a level of privilege. The issue is you're playing the privilege game and you're weighing everything on their side. That's incredibly problematic. I've already told you why. 2, social acceptance of mental health is higher than ours. Under our world, in their world, the incentive to deny blame is incredibly, incredibly higher. That is to say, on the government level, there's a rhetorical reason that you don't want people to be blaming you for causing the problems that made people have incredible mental health struggles. That is to say, if poor people are depressed apparently just because they are poor, then the government is going to be feel incredible amounts of incentive to avoid that blame being placed on them. On the practical level, they don't want to have to funnel all of their money into this just because they're being blamed for it. In the societal level, you don't want individuals to focus on the powerlessness that they have in a situation. Under their world, it necessarily must reconcile with the fact that every single person is dealing with these societal issues, which means that necessarily we're all fucked. We don't have any control. So why don't I just sit in my room all day and be sad because these situations are not solvable if the government doesn't solve it? I'm just gonna have to be fucking depressed all the time. That's shitty. Second, the intensity of where the blame lies under their side is higher. The analysis I've already given you of the parent feeling really, really shit because all of it's going to them because that's the only level of lack of privilege that I have. These sort of situations are incredibly problematic. The imperative then is that the government gets to show benevolence on our side. Like they do when they fucking get to say, hey, we're solving cancer. It wasn't our fault that cancer exists, but we're gonna help people solve it anyway, because that's something we care about our citizens. We care about the people that exist. The issue is that on their side, those people, the government's just being blamed and hated to a point at which, if it's not solvable and people will hate them in either world, why would they want to tell them? 3, treatment from other support communities improves on our side. The focus on self-reflection and personalized treatment is incredibly necessary for any mental health struggle. That is to say, therapy doesn't say, hey, which levels of privilege did you have? They go, tell me about how you were taught to view this certain thing in your life. Tell me about these specific experiences you have. This is the narrative that we need to be training people with, because that is the most realistic one. Proud to oppose.
We'd like to thank the speaker for an excellent speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Is this one good? I want to firstly characterize how the focus on societal factor exactly manifests in society, and I want to claim that this focus is likely to be nuanced and well depicted, and this already, I will explain this later on, significantly mitigating the impact we get from opening a position. First observation, I think that there is a competition mechanism among psychiatrists and psychology experts in general to sort of explore to new experiences, insofar as there are multiple different, mental health research institutes, for instance, and they compete for the dominance. So, one institute might focus predominantly on the issue of racial minority, the other might primarily focus on the issue of LGBT individual, how they cope with the, mechanism like coping, coming out, for instance. And what that means is that there's a wide range of, disprivileges and experiences of the structural problem in society that these mental health coverage is probably going to happen on the outside of the house. This already significantly mitigates the impact of the opening of the student. Because the problem with opening of the student was like, oh, if you don't fit the narrative of this privilege, you're going to feel bad about you being mentally ill. But the problem is that wide range of experiences of this privilege is going to be depicted on the outside of the house. That means that the impact is significantly lower to the only very exclusive, most privileged individual in society. Secondly, I want to point out that there is an incentive for capturing individualized experiences within the framework of collective struggle. That is to say, obviously, in the instance where psychiatrists are saying that all these mental health issues are really, really severe, guys, you have to make an interview, for example, towards an actual individual, to actual college student, black college student that is suffering from the mental health issue. It's what in order to make a convincing argument, you have to make sure you have to make a concretized story. You're going to still interview individualized experiences. You're going to report on these things. That means that within the framework of collective struggle of the African American community, you're still going to depict individualized experiences, and to that extent, a lot of people are able to still appreciate it under our side of the house. By contrast, their side of the house, focus on individualized experiences is likely to be unnuanced and come from the privileged backgrounds. The reason for this is that media is highly controlled by privileged people vastly, and privileged are the ones that are probably going to depict on their side of the house. This is like white girls on TikTok telling about how you had a hard day. Obviously, when African American people see this, obviously, you have all the privilege in the world. Why are you guys talking about this, right? The other thing, obviously, is that predominantly in movies, for example, you're going to have predominantly white characters, and their suffering being depicted, their mental health issues being depicted. This changes substantially on the outside of the house. And we're going to talk about one substantive here. We have increased capacity to be able to tackle mental health issues better, specifically catered towards minority community in particular. One, note NASA's, there are 3 things that I want to talk about. One is note that NASA's unresponsive mechanism in terms of why we have simply more depiction of mental health issues because of the fact that the media have more incentive to cast the spotlight on it, and people have more likelihood of being able to voice out when it's not couched on the private individualized experiences. People are more likely going to be able to voice out. But the second thing to point out is that we have simply increased societal resources for psychiatrists and mental health research institute in general. Firstly, because we get more support and awareness due to the social movements co-opting this narrative. The second thing is that we have simply increased state support. And here's critical. I think that is a significant incentive for politicians to be able to utilize the rhetoric of all African American kids being disproportionately suffering from mental health issues, because a lot of the times in the functional democracy where like there are two dominant political parties, I think minority plays a key significant role in like which political party wins. So political party have an incentive to tailor to the preferences of minority community and the outside of the house. And what this means is that when you count it in the context of social justice, when you count it in the context of minority discrimination, we get infinitely more state support and state subsidy and like societal support in general for resources that are currently backing towards mental health issues, for example. So we get more like medical equipment, we have more medication, we simply have more like state funding towards hospitals that have the branches of mental health support and the outside of the house. The third thing is a demographic change within the psychological experts in the community. That is to say, predominantly in the status quo, the problem is the vast majority of psychiatrists and psychology experts, therapists, tend to come from white backgrounds because they're privileged. It's a highly elitist institution. But now this changes in three major ways. One is the racial minority now have the power in these fields insofar as minority struggle is being valued. So if you come from the similar backgrounds, your opinion is more likely to be valid. The second thing to point out is that we just simply have more depiction of social discrimination in, for example, textbook or medical school, for instance, and therefore people, even if you come from a privileged background, you have more understanding of minority struggle on the outside. The third thing to point out is that we just simply have more research on, for example, things like minority students, how they specifically suffer, insofar as they describe. There's like the race to the, exploring more and more diverse range of depiction of minority suffering on the outside house. So we get simply more understanding of minority struggle on the outside. And that's why I think the our narrative is far better. Let's respond to OO. Opening opposition first is, and the weighing, even if you believe everything that opening opposition talks about, weighing is quite clear. Their primary impact occurs in the instance where the person is privileged, where the person is rich, cannot categorize themselves as any minority community. Obviously, these people have more wealth to be able to go to therapists. These people can afford many things. These people probably have better social connection and therefore have friends to be able to cope with the mental health illnesses. But we are talking about a most vulnerable minority individual in society who have no alternative to be able to mitigate the impact of mental health issues. On that way, we clearly win the debate. The first argument they have is on blame. I want to point out that the individualized experiences is more likely to put blame under their side past flipping their case. The reason for this is that when it comes to you thinking that, oh, it's because of you that is suffering from the mental health issue, and obviously you're going to blame, for example, the fact that you specifically are being bullied in the classroom because I'm not good enough. So you're going to start blaming yourself under their side of the house, but rather under our side, when you couch it in the context of social struggle, you're able to blame the external factor of society being bad. Obviously blame such far decreases. The next thing that they say, and this is really too optimistic from opening opposition, is that, individual on their side can be hopeful that you yourself can change for the world, but we're talking about a context of depression. We're talking about a context of mental health issue. Obviously, you're not able to become hopeful. That magic blade of opening up opposition does not work. Final point, clarification.
If you tie mental illness to Black Lives Matter, and that's where the mental health movement's primary level of traction is, how likely is it that a Republican politician will want to fund a psychiatric hospital?
The response is simple. Again, the minority community occupies a greater role in the electoral system. I think the Republican Party, to a large extent, have an incentive to still fund these things. Insofar as I think that there are a wide variety of ranges of mental health experiences, not just Black Lives Matter, but also other experiences that are going to be depicted in media generally. Okay. I want to point out NASA's mechanism of why, firstly, people who are currently mentally ill, it's harder for them to voice out, still has got an issue, and it's harder for people to be able to reach out to people who have mental health issues because people think it's a private matter that you should not just sort of get yourself into. Obviously, has gone unresponded to. I think we get infinitely better help on the outside. Final thing I'm going to do is to respond to COSPOI that people won't watch fiction because it's framed as minority stuff. Majority of people shut their mouth, their ear out of it. Three reasons why it's not true. One, majority of people can empathize with the experiences of poverty and the disprivileges in general. Even if you come from the rich backgrounds, you still face the financial difficulty of paying up your tuition in college, for example. So at some point in your life, when you're young, when you're old, you face the problem of financial difficulty and some kind of privilege. Secondly, many majority communities are more likely to be allies of social justice movement rather than the issue of the mental health issue because social justice movement gets historically more awareness on the outside. For these reasons, it is quite clear in the debate. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for your excellent speech and close the topic of the debate here for the opposition.
Right, so this is being live streamed, right? I mean, in case my mother is watching, I'm not blaming you, Mom. accept your trade-off. Because you need to accept the trade-off that there's going to be some level of compartmentalization based on external factors. Otherwise, I can use your mech to say that there is some competition incentive exists for psychologists to have reasons to blame the system as well, because blaming the system is woke and it makes people feel a little better. Perhaps, I don't know. So I just think you need to accept the trade-off, like we accept the trade-off that there's going to be some disassociation from social factors. I mean, again, this is just bad debating. All right, 3 things in my speech. First, on awareness and social acceptance. Note that their argument is media coverage increases. 1, I think there's independent reasons for media to cover poor localities, of how piss poor healthcare systems are, piss poor, how poor the computer science labs are, etc., etc. But second, never told you how big the margin is. So for example, yeah, you get more media coverage, but what is that additional 10 minutes of TV time do to people's minds? But I think Kayla's argumentation just takes out, even if you believe that there's more media coverage than there will. Because Kayla told you that the government and society doesn't want to take accountability anymore the moment in time you start blaming them. Simple reason. Government doesn't want to take the fact that they're the reason why kids are depressed nowadays, because it's very bad rhetorically for their campaign, but is a tool that is used to just say that, governments are shit towards minorities. Governments never want to take accountability for it. But on a societal level, the majority, i.e. white people, don't want to take accountability for the fact that structural racism caused the fact, or gentrification of certain localities caused black communities to have poorer schools, black communities to have poorer hospitals, and structurally, that's the reason why they're suffering from mental health crises. So what does happen, even if you have more media, media attention, is that more people disassociate. More people try to say that this is not our fault. I.e., more people try to reject the fact that you're causing, more people try to reject the gravity of your mental health crisis, specifically if you're a minority. Why is that comparatively better under our world? It's because I think governments always try to be benevolent. So government tries to cure cancer because, hey, guess what? Government didn't cause cancer, but they're the first one to fucking solve it. Second, white people try, again, I think if donations increase from white people under our world, even if it's tokenistic donations, it's good because insofar as they want to show the fact that they're helping black people in order, to uplift themselves in one way, shape, or form, I think it is categorically good. Insofar as you don't make it harder for societal systems to accept the fact that mental health is an issue, which, again, they make it harder for them because they put them on the defensive. I think we just get more funding under our world, more acceptance under our world, in which case, the taboo to a certain degree is broken. Second, let's talk about blame. Yes. Look, under their world, their idea of blame is simple. They say that there's a taboo of mental health and you blame yourself, that, oh, I made the wrong decisions, I was the one who screwed up. And that's bad because, when you're a minority, some things are out of your hand. I agree, panel, that there is going to be some blame under our world you place on yourself. But the difference is, what do you do about it? Because under their world, Kayla gave you 2 structural reasons as to why you blame even more under their world. A, because you see a fellow minority from your conditions make it to Harvard and you don't, and then you go what the fuck, right? But second, when you get to Harvard and you still feel depressed as a black person, you're again, what the fuck? So in both of these cases, under their world, here's what you're trying to do. Under their world, either you're trying to change the system, which is materialistically very demoralizing, because I don't know if you know, protests don't always work, and that's fucking disgusting. But second, you're in this materialistic treadmill. You're the better house I get, the better car I get, the better university I go to will suddenly solve my mental health because that's the compartmentalization that I was made to believe in. Which means that your blame is constant, your blame is long-term, ours isn't. Because under our world, we don't tell you that if you get a better house, you will be less depressed. We tell you that it's about your worldview. It's about the fact that you've never felt loved by your parents, so surround yourself with people that love you, for example. Which means that these are more attainable. The reason why that's just on a weighing scale, the deadlock breaker, is because the last thing you want to make someone with mental health feel is that they're alone and powerless, or they cannot make any actionable changes in their life. Because the moment that happens, is that the reason why they can't get up from bed, right? Is exactly the moment in time they try to set an unrealistic goal of making it to Harvard in order to feel better about their mental health. Note that the actions we ask them to take when it comes to personal history are A, more doable, but B, actually helps you when it comes to these things. For all these reasons, Platinum, on the blame metric, know that they blame themselves more, actions are more likely under our world. Lastly, on tangible actor, so doctor treatments and all that stuff, getting better before that CG.
this is a false comparative. The problem is, even if you make incremental steps to change your life, socioeconomic and social factors continue to set you back over the course of time. This makes you feel more defeated rather than less because you took that step, took that risk, and then got fucked over by things outside of your
Yeah, but societal structures don't change under your world too. Yeah, you get these people to protest a little more, but the moment in time the protests don't work, which oftentimes it doesn't, like again, okay, you can be angry and protest and depressed at the same time. The anger of protest and taking down the system doesn't take away the fact that when you go back from the protest and you're lying in your bed, you feel shit about yourself. So understand, panel, just one thing doesn't take away the other. Right. Alright. The first thing I'd like to say in terms of tangible actions being changed, I think people are more likely to go, I think doctors will treat these people better. Let's keep this simple. The reason is doctors are more likely to compartmentalize under their world. Why? Because of overcrowding issues, right? Which I understand. We don't change the overcrowding issue, but we set the precedent for what standard practice is. That don't say that, oh, you're this compartment of socioeconomic factor patient, but rather we insist that society tells doctors to take bigger steps. But second, I think people go to doctors more under our world. And here's two reasons why. Because A, they feel like doctors don't tell them things that they already know. You already know your experience as to going to school was shit because your school wasn't great, and your doctor's gonna say that, oh, it was socioeconomic factors, and you're like, okay, so again, as people who've gone to therapy, sometimes doctors say things that are redundant and doesn't help you. Under our world, doctors tell you things that you can action tomorrow, which again I think is much better. But third, I think you're just more empowered to talk about your experiences, because I don't know if you know, people like sharing their personal history. People or it's easier to share personal history than go oh, because I came from a shit school, I may be a shit debater or whatnot, instead of me saying that I just didn't like to read, that's why sometimes I have a hard time speaking English. You're more empowered to talk about these things because people connect on personal history. So panel, from all these grounds, please vote no.
We'd like to thank the speaker for an excellent speech and to open the bottom half of the debate. Here for the Member of Government.
Cool. Everybody ready? This debate is about far more than just the quality of some media depictions of mental health. This debate is about addressing the causes and consequences of mental health issues. The two extensions I'm going to forward in CG will outlay the top half very intuitively by first proving why the quality of the interventions we get on our side of the house when we address the cause and consequence at the societal level is better and more funded and more comprehensive. And then I'm going to explain why, even if you don't believe that, the quality of the intervention must structurally be worse on their side. Before that, responses to opening opposition. The first, the deadlock in the top half is about relatability, i.e. whether or not people relate more to shows, TVs, movies than minorities, or they relate more to narratives that pay attention or are similar to their own life experience, even if they are not minorities. I want to point out just directly that opening government hangs their hat on very specific portrayals of how this suffering looks like. I don't think this looks just like minorities, and I don't think this just looks like focusing on marginalized communities to the only extent. This looks like narratives of socioeconomic poverty. This looks like analogies about being hungry, telling suffering about lack of access to spaces that are wealthier. These are things that are universal experiences that the vast majority of people have experienced in society. The vast majority of the people in the world do live paycheck to paycheck. The vast majority of people who are vulnerable to things like COVID, recessions, losing a mortgage on their house because of financial crisis and things like this. Telling stories about these kinds of things means necessarily that these people do get some degree of buy-in to this narrative. But secondly, focusing on socioeconomic factors doesn't just mean focusing on the most disprivileged. It means discussing the relative degrees of privilege that exist in society. So there can still be books like Hillbilly Elegy by J.G. Vance that talk about the opiate crisis and how fucked over white people in the communities there, without also simultaneously getting media that is heterogeneous that talks about other individuals. But finally, I just think most people do relate to struggles of social factors. And the reason this is true is because most people understand the fear that they could be without a roof on their heads at some point. Just gut check this as the average individual. You lived through multiple recessions. You lived through COVID. You lived through watching many of your friends and family seep into poverty due to the subprime mortgage loan crisis. What this means is that these narratives, when they emerge, are just likely to be far, far more relatable. And crucially, the people making these policies and the people pushing for these policies to be adopted, policymakers, universities, studies, the people who are funding these things, have incentives to cater to this kind of policy insofar as they want the relatability so they can get votes and get support for these kinds of things. So this is why this portrayal is likely to look this way. This is why this is going to happen. The second thing I want to take out is opening opposition's idea that more discussion leads to better discussion, i.e. that an increased focus on mental health will get better discussion. I think the problem with O is they're contingent on proving that more discussion ends up materializing in actual benefits. I think the inverse is true and the nuance becomes far worse. Opening government says, you homogenize narratives, and the reason they give for this is because it is very difficult to portray nuanced individual struggles, and privileged descriptions rise to the top. The problem is I'm not sure why privileged descriptions always rise to the top from their speech. The mechanism that fills this gap in opening government is that when you have more content creators, more people who make diagnoses, more people who make TV shows portraying their content, i.e. on their side of the house, they want to make money off of those things, and they also want these things to be broadly relatable to a number of people. This means they want their content to curate it and cater to the majority of people as possible. The problem is that when they do this, they necessarily portray these things in an incredibly problematic manner. That is, they homogenize the types of coping mechanisms that each individual person has at every level. Moreover, even if they don't homogenize these things, they necessarily portray it in a less nuanced way, because they want it to be relatable to the median individual, which means that the nuance of people who have different coping mechanisms and suffer from different things at different times are less likely to feel related and more likely to feel alienated by the thing. But finally, I just think when individual discussion becomes far more heightened, there is a huge focus on these things and people talking about their problems because of the focus of these things. What this means is that people with alternative coping mechanisms that don't fit into the dominant majority opt out of mental health care to a vastly greater extent. I think that that's bad. The final thing I want to address is the idea that makes people with relatively more privilege feel bad. Note I already took this out when I said socioeconomic degrees of disprivilege exist. We can talk about that on our side. But more importantly, given this is a shift in focus, I think very wealthy people or more wealthy people will predominantly have better access to individualized care on either side. Extension. This debate will come down to funding for interventions and solutions, studies, universities, things like this to a much greater degree. CO agrees, looking forward to hearing them clash with this. I think the first extension I want to forward is that even if you fund and popularize individual solutions, tons of impoverished people just structurally lack access to benefit from them in the first place. Why? Note that these people often live paycheck to paycheck. They live in absolute poverty for a large degree of their life, and they're therefore unlikely to see the intervention on their side as particularly proximate to them. But even if not, lower order concerns often are just more proximate to you, because while mental health struggles can be incredibly hard and isolating, there are often a large number of socioeconomic factors that are quite a greater issue to. But thirdly, in the absence of addressing socioeconomic factors that cause and aggregate mental health issues, this means they become self-perpetuating. Meaning on their side they address the end point of the harm rather than the beginning. Like you treat your mental health condition, you get out of bed and you feel less depressed, but then you return to your life from before and it becomes aggravated again. This beats OG, because OG says minorities are vulnerable to health issues, but A, minorities are one subset of impoverished people, our harm is far larger in scale, but B, it's unclear why minorities can't also benefit from individualized intervention on their side either. So even if they would be better off in the kinds of experiences that O wants to depict on their side, they just never do so in the first place without the intervention that happens on our side of the house. Why is it easier to fund and address socioeconomic grievance on our side? This is the second extension. The first claim I want to make here is weighing to OG. OG is remarkably weak on explaining why the case that political capital comes about on their side. The mechanism that NASA gives is more awareness and popularization means it is easier to depict this in a way that translates into political capital. I'm going to rise above this and say, even if they get equal political capital, the interventions are worse and therefore outweigh them. First, on their side, money is simply more divided. When you have to dedicate solutions at the individual level, you atomize and divide the pool of money at each level, because individual solutions, in order to make them the nuance at the degree to which they are necessarily far more cost intensive. On our side of the house, you can target things at specific communities, like projects, like people with socioeconomic disabilities, who more easily access studies and things like this to do this. So targeting interventions becomes far harder on their side and far easier on ours. But secondly, when you focus on socioeconomic grievance, it's far more politically palatable to broad elements of the political spectrum. The reason why this is true quite intuitively is that A, the narrative can be sold in a variety of ways to different communities, i.e. looking at economic harm in rural Appalachia to poor white people and some individuals, while also looking at black people's struggles as well. But secondarily, the broader elements of the political spectrum are far more likely to feel that it is appropriate to them for all the reasons I gave in characterization framing about why societal factors are largely medium. Before I explain the rest of this implication, open it up.
Look, the book provides necessary analysis of interpersonal improvements that make you feel better even when you don't have access to therapy or medication.
This is the critical problem. You take a few steps forward to get an individualized solution. Then the structural problem happens on their side and it hits you in the face and you feel like you can't get up again. We give you the means to get up again by proving that on our side the societal discourse necessarily provides the solutions that allow you to address the harm at the starting point rather than the ending point, and to address the concerns to a far greater degree. The third thing I want to highlight here is repeat costs. Often trauma and societal factors are super interlinked. I mean, you get duplicate costs for each intervention for exactly the reason that they said. So you intervene once, they get out of bed, and they spend the same amount of time reconvincing them to do so after the structural oppression forces them down. But thirdly, I think it's harder to group people into categories to target interventions, because mental health is often very nebulous and very nuanced. This means it costs way more money again, but more importantly, increase the risk of causing harms to people by accidentally misdiagnosing them, by accidentally doing these things. In order to intervene at scale, it's just far harder on their side, it's far easier on ours. The final thing I just want to note is there's less political capital for addressing these policies, because each individual mental health cause gets some degree of traction and support, but all these social movements compete and are at odds with one another. On our side of the house, there is far more greater degree of unity because every politician and business employs poor people or people who struggle to some degree, so they have more of an incentive to be responsive to this. This rise above OG because we rise above the clash of how depicted. Even if some equal depictions of equal quality exist on either side, the quality of depictions in actual medical interventions are less. So we mechanize their point about doctors, nurses, hospitals, and things like that. But more importantly, we find out even if neither of this is true, the homogenization and the discourse that they get on their side necessarily precludes the solutions they want to happen. Never been prouder to win from closing them.
We'd like to thank the speaker for an excellent speech and welcome the member of opposition here.
The two most important ways that we can help people facing mental health struggles in society is one, getting more funding for mental health services, and two, reducing stigma so that these people actually access these mental health services. This is how we're going to win the debate from CO today without two extensions. But before then, I'd like to do some reframing. I find it incredibly weird that the entire opening half debate was about media depictions. Risk aversion to media and things like age-restricted ratings means that TV shows and movies talking about mental health narratives is viewed on both sides. That is when it happens and is done well. For example, in the show Sex Education, it is praised so widely because it is very, very rare. But second of all, media companies' incentives is make money, right? They have a profit incentive. So when mental health issues are discussed and are depicted in the media, they're often sensationalized, things like 13 Reasons Why, incredibly triggering, not helpful at all. More realistic conceptualization of this debate is that the focus on societal, communal, political institutions. Those are the kinds of institutions that are doing this refocusing that is happening on both sides of the debate. This looks like the American Psychological Association, things like political parties, etc. There are two reasons why these are the people that matter. First of all, they dominate the narrative anyway. They have the authority of things like writing the DSM and diagnosis manuals. But second of all, the orientation and the focus these institutions choose are extremely influential because when things like political parties decide to reframe things, this dominates things like the media narrative and changes people's minds. First extension, a focus on societal factors guts funding for mental health. This is more important than any of the material about self-perception or opening half because mental health issues are like physical health issues. Like obviously you need the antidepressants and you need diagnosis in order to get help at all. And if there's no funding or training for things that people need, obviously they cannot get help. So how is mental health funding hard on their side? First reason, there is lower political capital in general. More privileged people have more political power, and even if not, more privileged people are more likely to vote on soft issues such as mental health. Poor people often only vote on things that affect them, like in terms of their paycheck, things like redistribution, things like having a school in their community. So when political parties associate mental health therapy with social disadvantage, they lose the average voter base who is like 10 feet middle class, the people who are swing voters. The party who supports mental health funding loses, mental health funding decreases. Second of all, political backlash from conservatives. Conservatives do not want to support things like Black Lives Matter, so they will just not vote on things like mental health services. This is not just that, right? It's that they will actively pursue narratives that are harmful for the campaign for mental health funding. Things like associating mental health with concepts like being a snowflake, that is going to harm mental health funding. Third of all, mental health funding other types of policy are just simply harder to pass. For example, when the Democratic Party wants to pass mental health funding in like an omnibus redistribution bill that also helps climate change, this is when the Conservatives are going to block this kind of bill, and this is when these kinds of mental health funding are not going to be passed. Fourthly, progressive narratives turn off the most vulnerable in a lot of cases. This is especially in developing and non-Western countries, where the most vulnerable people are often not the most progressive, right? This is like Muslims in Malaysia, things like Dalits in India. These people do not support the most progressive social policies like gay marriage or something like that. Psychological institutions are already seen as progressive or even too progressive in these places. The Tata Institute of Social Sciences in India are the ones that give out certificates for people like psychiatrists, and people already perceive these psychiatrists as way too progressive and not caring about the issues that actually matter to them. This is why they become more relatable and people are more likely to seek out their services, and they're more likely to get funding by people like local governments when they are focused on narratives such as personal issues personalized to the people who are actually suffering, rather than like, I don't know, intergenerational hermeneutical injustice who nobody understands what that even means. What is the comparative here? First of all, mental health becomes a bipartisan issue. This is going to happen because independent of the woke narratives on their side, mental health is naturally something that conservatives or even everybody wants to support for three reasons. First of all, everybody has problems in their lives, and those problems feel
even people who are extremely privileged want things like psychiatry services because they want to feel better, because they feel sad in their lives. Second of all, mental health diagnosis is more likely for privileged people. So it's more likely that privileged people without mental health issues care about mental health issues because their friends probably have a diagnosis. That is why they're more likely to vote for things like mental health funding if it's devoid of things like Black Lives Matter. Third of all, privileged people often feel more sad and feel like their issues are more important because they are facing less adversity in their lives. So when they face some adversity, they think it's a big problem and they want funding for it. This is what like the men's rights movement was. They think men deserve more psychological funding. The impacts of this argument are, one, we get better laws. We get things like anti-discrimination for people with mental health issues in the workplace when it becomes bipartisan, when there is gridlock in things like the Congress. But second of all, we get more funding for care, especially in disadvantaged areas, and more buy-in for that care for people who don't like progressivism. Second of all, we get less politicization, fewer attacks on mentally ill people by people like Trump, which is going to be incredibly harmful when that happens and is centered in media. Opening?
So individualized experiences of mental health struggle is oftentimes deeply stigmatized. People don't talk about it. Therefore, we have no necessary political capital for bipartisan cooperation.
Great, stigmatization, that's my second extension. Why does their side increase stigma? Note that Uru's version of this argument is just that people blame themselves and their parents. The problem with this is that mental health issues are often more prevalent in young people, and intergenerational stigma actually works the other way when parents blame their children for having mental health issues. So there are three reasons why stigma increases on their side. First reason is that it entrenches older generation's idea that mental health is this like pop new thing that just like being young, people being not tough enough. This is because systematic issues like socioeconomic inequality are actually reducing over time. People are getting richer over time. There are more investments in poorer areas over time. But things like mental health diagnoses are increasing over time. So it doesn't really make sense, right? If like mental health issues are actually caused by socioeconomic disadvantage, then shouldn't mental health issues be decreasing over time? This is the kind of thing that old people think in their families, and that's why they place a lot of pressure on young people for them to just like get tougher, and that's how they think they should solve mental health issues. But when mental health issues are tied to specific personal experiences that the older generation do not understand, it is more likely that they are destigmatized. Second of all, criticizing systems are never going to get buy-in from everyone because some people inevitably benefit from that system. If you criticize systems such as taxation, such as college entrance exams, or even bigger systems such as like, I don't know, white privilege or something, if mental health issues are associated with these systems and solving mental health issues requires the dismantling of these systems, this is never going to get the buy-in of those who benefit from those systems, and therefore there's likely to be more stigma. But three, leaving a community that is stigmatized. This is incredibly important because for a lot of people, their own communities are the ones who are traumatizing them. The parents are the ones who are traumatizing children. The black husband or the Asian husband is the one who's traumatizing the Asian wife. If you tie the mental health issues with entire communal issues and the suffering are meant to be shared, that is when the stigmatization increases on their side. The comparative is people naturally want to destigmatize mental health issues because they themselves want help and they want help for their loved ones. They naturally want to buy into these narratives if these narratives are not counterintuitive to what they already believe in. On our side, we get less stigma, we get more mental health funding, we get less politicization. Very proud to oppose.
We'd like to thank the speaker for an excellent speech and to close the convention of this debate here for the government whip.
I'll let you know when I'm ready. Just checking that there's no tech break on here. Great. Everybody ready? Great. 3, 2, 1. I'm fine saying it's a back half debate because the two teams advance to the finals. We don't have to be the first, we can just be the second. But I'm going to explain to you why it's likely not going to be a back half debate when they fall out, because we flip all of their mechanisms. The first thing I want to address is the politicization that exists on our side, because this is their first important mess. Note the first thing they say is you politicize it because you tie it to controversial issues. Here's how we flip it. On our side, when the medical industry adds that focus, they add the legitimacy that the movement otherwise needs to these societal issues. So they say literally the board journal of the American Psychiatric Association says that these things are likely responsible. Secondarily, and this is where Matt's extension is critical, it's far easier to push for these policies because they are widely more distributable. You don't have to atomize each funding. You can aggregate the economies of scale that allows for contentious budgetary issues to be more appealable on our side. Thirdly, but note, for Matt's analysis about the broad relatability of it across socioeconomic issues. On their side, they say you can destigmatize it, or you comparatively destigmatize it more, because on their side you can tap into individual experiences. But note Matt's analysis for it doesn't have to be tied to minorities, but the fact that everybody understands what it's like, for example, when you cannot provide for your kid the Christmas present that they want to, and then you have to yell at them saying, I can't afford it, and then how that, for example, triggers all of the psychiatric issues that they have later on in life. But thirdly, keep in mind the way this likely looks. These movements can probably decouple it from buzzwords that are hard to understand and don't tie to controversial political policies like the Green New Deal, for example, or things that are likely to cause that backlash. But fourthly, note, once you make it on societal factors, you can have cooperations between different mental health movements that are pushing for various kinds of mental health policies. So mental health movements operate, for example, on providing more funding to parental leave that are based on, for example, allowing kids to develop properly so they don't have generational issues afterwards, or providing more health psychiatrists on university campuses. That is saying when it's tied to social issues and not individual and atomized, that's why you can collectivize the political capital more on our side. But the second thing they say is, rich people have comparatively more political capital, which is why we're comparatively less able to access it with socioeconomic issues. Even if this is true, note that they still have to respond to the median voter, and that's why they'll still, for example, they still build healthcare systems that provide access to median voters. So even if, for example, the rich political capital that they talk about exists on their side, the difference is that they don't push for the actual kinds of policy that are going to be able to help people on the ground, because they push for individualized things like more funding to school guidance counselors, but a school doesn't have a school guidance counselor in the first place to the underfunded school they talk about. On being destigmatized, I'm going to flip it. I think it is easier to stigmatize on their side and have a race to the bottom for the people that don't want to provide the funding, because you can pick the most outrageous, ludicrous scenario of an individual pushing for mental health, for example, saying, I need mental health services because I can't do my schoolwork and I'm going to fail my exam, when they say, you should just work harder. The difference is it's far harder to do that stigma when it's broad, relatable policies or socioeconomic factors that Matt told you about. Let's wait to OG and then dismantle and delete the OO case. Firstly on OG, note their entire case presumes that individual factors must necessarily be painted as the choice of individuals. That is, you blame yourself. But I don't know why this is the case. I don't know why they can't say it's individual factors like genetics, for example, that is not the blame and focus on the individual. So the OG case is susceptible to these kinds of claims from opening from op-ed. Here's why they're mixed. Each single one of them is comparatively weaker than Matt's. Firstly, they say you tie to media incentives comparatively more because it's hard to understand the individualness of the issue on-site opposition. But presumably media might also want new and fresh takes not being receptive that are not receptive to societal issues to target new audiences. I don't know why the media don't have the same specific incentive on their side to still relate to things, or why they can't be relatable on their side. They don't explain it. Secondarily, they say it ties in with social movements and things that they otherwise push for. Note this doesn't have a massive belt in this round, because most social movements include mental health as a major issue to solve, regardless, because it's something that affects their community irrespective of the fundamental cause that actually causes it. So it's an end impact that I don't know why has it's an end impact on either side, which is why social movements will likely care about it on either side, which is why this mechanism itself doesn't have much delta. But thirdly, they say individuals feel more comfortable talking about it. One, this makes a large generalization about how comfortable people feel when they may have a variety of different preferences, but secondarily, it's also susceptible from that maybe people are comparatively more comfortable because telling their story, because it's theirs, they feel more comfortable as opposed to using or talking about societal factors that they don't know or don't understand. The upshot of all of this is that I problematized all of their mechanisms, not knife them, but just said why they are comparatively unpersuasive in the face of ops rebuttal. What is the upshot of this? Why do max that way? Firstly, the practicality of our solutions are far easier, even if not perfect. But we don't need them to be perfect because the fundamental issues many people don't have access in the first place. So the point of all of this is that irrespective of what you buy from their mechanisms, the difference that no matter who's pushing for this policy, the fact that it can be done at the societal level and you don't have to divide different resources is far more palatable. But secondarily, Matt explains why the portrayals are appealing to broad numbers of people in society, i.e. the people you need to actually get on your side, the people who have the political capital that opposition talks about. And I want to be fair. OGs to their credit say, there's some level of comparativeness. But the difference is they're not comparative in the relatability that exists on both sides. What math tells you is like, yes, you might be able to relate on both sides, but you're comparatively better on our side because of the ways in which hunger is an easy thing to understand. But it's comparatively harder to understand when your kid is always crying, when another person's kid is always crying, but yours is not. Why?
On funding, we told you that government can deny responsibility so that majorities can too because you blame them. Under our world, we just have to say that let's collectivize under mental health because you can face it too.
The difference is it's comparatively harder on your side because people face mental health in a number of different ways, and it's far harder for those social movements to collaborate on their side, but it's far harder to push for those policies when you divide them across a number of different sectors that are far easier to problematize with the budget. Now, I want to dismantle their max. They say it's a reduction of blame. One note, they knife their case in the second part because they say, you don't feel responsible, but you feel like you have no control. And if you feel like you have no control, you probably don't have the blameworthiness that they talk about. But their second knife is interpersonal friends and relationships. I'm going to flip this back. On their side, you blame individual factors far more because they are not societal factors. I.e. the motion says their side is the personal issue, so you blame your parents substantially more than you could otherwise on our side. Even if you buy none of this, note that on either side they say, but at least you take some ownership, you do the things that you want to get better. Note that misinformation channels exist on both sides. The difference is that those are the comparatively more accessible ones on their side, and they're substantially worse when they do it on the individual level. Why? Because individuals take it upon themselves to seek solutions because they think they can, but they can't because they're not a psychiatrist. This looks like self-diagnosis, like people who might not have a mental illness going and saying, because I saw a pattern of someone who procrastinated and has depression, I might have depression. Or they get incorrect diagnosis from people that don't have that legitimacy. The thing is, it's far easier for those manipulative figures on their side to pretend that they have the authority because they realize their own individual experience. They can't represent the broader societal issues. On every metric we want, please put us through.
We'd like to speak to maximum speech and to conclude the debate here for the opposition whip.
Let me first compare our case to OG. OG's entire case is contingent with people who have political will engaging with the media institution they want. So for any of OG's arguments to work, they have to prove that people who watch the media about mental illness, that they believe destigmatizes minorities who struggle with mental illness. They give us two mechanisms for this. One, they say a lot of people with privilege empathize with poverty at some point in their lives. For example, they have to do things like pay off their student loans. Two responses. One, this is not necessarily true. Poverty often tends to be generational. Climbing up the social ladder in most countries is deeply hard when you are competing with people who have things like inherited wealth and have to do things like have access to connections. You're competing, for example, for a college spot with someone who has a range of networks, whose family went to college. You're competing with someone who has the time to study at home because they don't have to take on a job at night, or they don't have to take on a job that prevents them from going to school or going to college. Second of all, even if you do have this historical experience, often you do not want a reminder of your poverty. You do not want a reminder of the times when your life was low. People often opt into media as an escape from discussions about the struggles that they experience, and this opting into media as an escape is shut out when they have to engage with media about mental illness from people much more marginalized than them. Second of all, OG says people are much more likely if their majorities to be aligned with things like social justice movements. They do not give us a reason why. The reason things like social justice movements exist is often because they have to conflict with the majority, because there isn't an existing political base to do things like give the movement access to support. This creates a large amount of conflict with people who are members of the majority and have access to political power, who often do not believe in the social movements opening government cares about. Vivian explains why engagement with the media is systematically unlikely on their side. Given this context, and given importantly, opening opposition's argument about engagement doesn't address OG's two responses, this response both outframes opening opposition and ensures the opening government case cannot work. Doing more comprehensive engagement with OG though. One, they say things like individual focus continues to exist in mental health institutions and psychiatrists, and that's why this debate is about the media. Two responses. One, it is possible for institutions like psychiatrists to focus on external factors. For example, to do something like as a therapist blame your job for your mental health conditions. I also think closing government is right. There are a range of alternative policies that aren't directly tied to mental illness, doing things like helping low-income communities that their side of the house can advocate. Second of all, they are right that ordinary individuals, people in your family, for example, continue to do things like check in on you. But we argue this is bad, and this flips their argument about blame, as well as Ahmed's response about why blame is more likely on our side. Why does it flip it? Because if there are people in your family, for example, who continue to check in on your individual circumstances, it's often them who are blaming you for being lazy, for blaming you for your mental health conditions. Therefore, what we need is a counter-narrative. If we have mental health institutions and the entire psychiatric community saying it's about individual circumstances, but not emphasizing individual circumstances in a way that pushes blame, because no psychiatrist would ever do that, that functions as a counter-narrative to people in your family, for example, who tell you that you are to be blamed for your mental illness, flipping the entire case. Second, they say minorities often uniquely struggle with mental illness and we need to provide attention for them through the media. Apart from not engaging with media disengagement, I think in the long term it is likely that media eventually represents minorities if it starts out representing privileged people. Because if it starts out representing privileged people, that's when they opt into consuming the media, but eventually they get bored of the same media depictions of mental illness, and that's the point where you diversify, therefore getting the types of representation that opening government want. Finally, on the extent of health. First, they say individuals are more comfortable speaking out on their side. I think this collapses into Vivian's extension on stigma. What we explain is we aren't able to change the structural factors like older generations telling you that mental health should be stigmatized. No individual will ever feel comfortable speaking up. But I also want to flip this argument because their mechanism for speaking out is literally people will no longer feel like it's a private issue. That means things like mental illness are much more likely to be outed in the media, therefore exposing vulnerable people's privacy to the majority social context that often stigmatizes mental illness. I think opening government is out of the round. Let's talk about our extension and how it engages with opening opposition as well. First, on long-term stigmatization. Ahmed's response is it's much easier for long-term stigmatization to exist on our side because they tell you should just work harder, for example. I think the important thing is that narratives of telling you to do things like work harder exist anyway when you have institutions like the family. What matters is the institutions that spread this narrative are people like psychiatrists who have no incentive to just tell you to work harder. Vivian explains why for genuine destigmatization of mental illness, often in deeply conservative communities where it's stigmatized, what you need is to fight generational stigma. You need to prove to the older generations in a conservative community in India that mental illness matters. And the only pathway to doing that is to ensure that you are able to tell them that mental illness isn't about the same structural problems that they experienced too when they were kids. And it's not just the current generation being substantially weaker, but rather specific individual circumstances that these people experience. And that is the pathway to get out of stigmatization. Second, though, we build mental health institutions better. Let me address Ahmed's flips right now. One, they say the medical industry adding focus adds legitimacy to the types of interventions they want. I think people's identities are a lot more tied to their politics than their trust of mental health institutions. No one really trusts the psychiatric community. If you're a conservative and the psychiatric community is attacking policies that conservatives support, you're not going to say, hey, now the psychiatric community is saying this, maybe I should stop being a conservative. Rather, you are more likely to be aligned to your political identity and therefore alienate the psychiatric establishment as a whole. Second, they say you shouldn't atomize people, it's better to have collectivized movements with broad relatability. Before I respond to this opening.
If, as you say, media doesn't cover about mental health issues, voters presumably do not know about the issue, political capital for funding you talk about in your extension does not stack. This debate is about relatively liberal community where people in media talk about the issue, which depiction is better.
But we've explained why social movements are rising, and insofar as they can be focused on mental health, it is possible to break down things like generational stigma in conservative communities. When you interact with a person who has mental illness and want to help them through, what you need though is institutions ensuring that blame isn't reflected. What you need is political capital to fund them. Okay, there are other responses on atomization and collectivization. One, atomization continues to exist because people in different communities have different socioeconomic needs too. Two, when you tie it to other social movements, it's likely you lose political capital. And let me engage that median voter response right now. Often the median voter is privileged because privileged people are simply more likely to do things like turn out to vote, but also getting the median voter requires things like getting access to advertisements, which requires the funding of the privileged. Therefore, you do need privileged buy-in. Why does this outweigh both opening opposition and closing government? opening opposition's arguments are focused on giving the individual hope, on giving the individual the ability to not blame themselves. The problem is mental illness is often all-encompassing. It affects every element of your life, and it is very hard for an individual to escape. We need social change. Finally, briefly on closing government. All of closing government's arguments about how these interventions are just wildly popular insofar as they are tied to socioeconomic issues doesn't explain why you need the mental health community to back these institutions. For example, if welfare is widely popular because hillbilly elegy was popular, you get a range of alternative social movements pushing for this as well. What we explain is the role of mental health institutions to destigmatize mental health specifically, and that's why we propose.
I would like to thank all speakers for the speeches. I would like to ask now all speakers and the audience kindly to fuck off.
Can we end the live stream?
Hey, I suggest we take like 2-3 minutes or so to go for our notes. I don't need to make a full call. If you